The news had arrived with the blunt force of a dropped history tome, shattering the quiet routine I'd meticulously constructed around my life. My great-aunt, a woman I'd met perhaps 3 times in my 42 years, had died, and in her passing, she'd left me Blackwood Manor. Me, Arthur, a historian whose primary relationships were with faded manuscripts and the dusty silence of university archives. I wasn't equipped for inheritance, certainly not for a sprawling, isolated estate in a forgotten corner of the country. I remember the solicitor's office, a sterile cube of polished wood and hushed tones. The man, a gaunt figure with spectacles perched on his nose, had laid out the terms with the detached precision of a cartographer charting unknown territory. He spoke of my great-aunt's final wishes, her reclusive life, and the sheer scale of the property. I recall sitting in a small, impersonal annex, a visiting room with reinforced glass separating the waiting area from the main offices, though it served no clear purpose beyond emphasizing a divide. The glass felt cold beneath my fingertips, a physical barrier matching the emotional distance I felt from the whole affair. My great-aunt's existence had been a faint whisper in the periphery of my family's narrative, a strange, enigmatic footnote. Now, I was expected to decipher her final, grand statement. My initial reaction, predictably, was pragmatic. Blackwood Manor reportedly contained a vast, untouched library, an archive ripe for historical excavation. My great-aunt, for all her eccentricities, had apparently been a collector. This, I decided, was the silver lining. I could catalog, preserve, perhaps even find a subject for my next monograph. The house itself, the burden of its upkeep, the sheer distance of it all, those were secondary concerns. Logistics. The drive north was a testament to the manor's isolation. Motorways dissolved into A roads, which then narrowed into single-track lanes hemmed in by ancient hedgerows. The sky, a bruised purple-gray all morning, pressed down closer with every mile. Rain began to fall, a fine, insistent drizzle that blurred the already desolate landscape. Trees, gnarled and skeletal, reached out from the roadside, their bare branches scratching against the low cloud cover like skeletal fingers. Finally, the lane gave way to a pair of colossal iron gates, rusted and overgrown with ivy. They stood ajar, groaning on their hinges as the wind sighed through them. Beyond lay a long, winding drive, choked with weeds and carpeted with fallen leaves. Blackwood Manor rose from the gloom like a sleeping beast. It wasn't merely large, it was immense. A thick blanket of ivy clung to its walls, devouring whole sections of masonry, giving the impression of a structure slowly being consumed by the very earth it stood upon. The sheer scale was daunting, humbling. It felt less like a house and more like a fortress, or perhaps a mausoleum. No lights glimmered from within, no smoke curled from its multiple chimneys. I parked my sensible saloon, its modern lines looking absurdly out of place against the manor's imposing antiquity. The air here was heavy, stagnant, carrying the scent of damp stone, decaying leaves, and something else, a faint, almost metallic tang like old blood or forgotten iron. The front door, a massive slab of oak studded with iron, opened with a protracted groan that echoed through the cavernous entrance hall. The hall was vast, the ceiling soaring to an unseen height. Dust motes danced in the anemic light, swirling like miniature galaxies. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of disused old wood, mildew, and that same strange, metallic tang, stronger now. To my left, a grand staircase, its banister intricately carved with grotesque faces, ascended into the gloom. To my right, a series of closed doors hinted at untold rooms. I walked deeper, my hand trailing along a wall. I paused, rationalizing it as a draft from a poorly sealed window or a chimney flue. Yet there was no breeze, no telltale rattle of glass. The air was utterly still. Then, from somewhere deep within the house, a faint sound reached me. It wasn't a creak or a groan of settling timbers, but something more deliberate, almost a scraping. I stopped, straining my ears, but heard nothing more than the thud of my own pulse. Just the house settling, I told myself, a relic of centuries. Nothing more, expectant. as if the manor itself was holding its breath. The Blackwood Manor loomed, a hulking silhouette against the bruised sky, its slate roof sharp as a broken tooth. My grey-tan, I mused, had certainly chosen an appropriate dwelling for her reclusive nature. The solicitor, a perpetually damp man with a briefcase that looked as old as the manor itself, had given me the keys with a sigh that suggested he was shedding a great burden. Everything untouched as per her will, he'd intoned, his voice raspy. Especially the archives. He was particular. Particular indeed. From the moment I stepped onto the gravel path, the air itself felt different, heavier, scented with damp earth and something indefinable, like old paper and forgotten wood smoke. The front door, a slab of dark oak studded with iron, groaned open, protesting my intrusion. Inside, the silence was immediate and profound, a thick blanket that absorbed sound. I ignored them, my historian's resolve firmly in place. I wasn't here for spectral audiences. I was here for the archives. My grey tants had been explicit. The archives were to be catalogued, preserved, and eventually donated to a suitable institution. My pragmatic mind, honed by decades of sifting through historical minutiae, relished the challenge. This wasn't just an inheritance, it was a professional undertaking. The solicitor had provided a rudimentary map, a spidery scrawl on yellowed parchment. The archives, it indicated, were in the oldest part of the house, accessible through a servant's passage off the main kitchen. The kitchen was a relic, its vast hearth cold, its copper pots tarnished green. The passage beyond was narrow, unlit, and smelled distinctly of mildew and something else. Something metallic like old pennies. My hand brushed against a wall, leaving a streak in the thick grime. Finally, a heavy wooden door, unmarked, stood before me. This had to be it. I wrestled with the iron latch, my muscles straining. With a final heave, it gave way, scraping against the stone floor with a sound like a tortured moan. Here, the scent of ancient paper was overwhelming, a rich, complex perfume of decay and preservation. The archives were immense, a labyrinth of towering shelves crammed with books, scrolls, leather-bound ledgers, and wooden boxes. Floor to ceiling, wall to wall, an entire history stood entombed here. Dust lay thick on every surface, undisturbed for decades. I set down my satchel, pulled out a battery-powered lantern, and switched it on. Its beam cut through the gloom, highlighting endless rows of forgotten knowledge. My grey-tant, for all her eccentricities, had been a meticulous collector. I saw no order, no system, just accumulation. My work was cut out for me. I started methodically, as always. Pick a section, clear a shelf, begin the initial assessment. I chose a section near the entrance, a wall of built-in shelves filled with what appeared to be family correspondence and journals. My fingers, gloved to protect against dust and acid, traced the spines. The silence was absolute, save for the faint creak of the old house settling around me. As I worked, a peculiar sensation began to prickle at the back of my neck. I paused, my hand hovering over a brittle leather volume. A historian's imagination, perhaps. No title, no author. Just a date faintly inscribed, 1887. I opened it carefully. The script inside was elegant, delicate, but the ink had faded to a ghostly brown. It seemed to be the diary of a young woman detailing mundane events, visits, garden observations, the weather. Nothing unusual. My head snapped up. I strained my ears, nothing. I returned to the journal. My eyes scanned a passage describing a difficult family decision. The shame of it all. He was so young. It felt specific, localized, clinging to my skin. I flipped forward a few more pages, searching for context. The handwriting grew more frantic, the lines less even. The walls listen. They always listen. The visiting room with reinforced glass. A cage for the mind. My breath hitched. A low, sibilant sound like air escaping a punctured tire emanated directly from the shelves behind the journal. My heart, which I prided myself on keeping steady, gave a sudden, hard thump. Nothing moved, nothing stirred. Yet the feeling of intense scrutiny had intensified, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I closed the journal, placing it back on the shelf with deliberate slowness. My hand trembled slightly. This was beyond the usual creaks and groans of an old house. This was an event. My rational mind struggled, grasping for explanations. The draft, the dust, the fatigue from travel. It was barely there, a ghost of a sound, yet it raised every hair on my arms. I stood frozen, the lantern beam a fragile circle in the vast, encroaching gloom. The archives, once a treasure trove, now felt like a predatory mouth, slowly closing around me. The silence was no longer profound, it was expectant. Arthur. My resolve, once so solid, began to fracture. This was not a professional undertaking. This was something else entirely, and it had just introduced itself. My mind, ever the pragmatist, immediately tried to dissect the memory. A trick of the light, perhaps, the groan of old timbers settling. An overactive imagination, fueled by isolation and the sheer weight of generations of forgotten lives packed into these dusty rooms. I was tired, that was it. Overwhelmed by the task ahead. My Grey-Tant's death, the unexpected inheritance, it was all a recipe for stress-induced hallucinations, wasn't it? I forced myself out of bed, the floorboards groaning in protest under my weight, and set about my morning routine with an almost aggressive normalcy. Coffee, a quick meal I barely tasted, then back to the archives. The solution, I told myself, lay in data, in facts, in the systematic cataloging of the past. The entity, whatever it was, couldn't withstand the scrutiny of a trained historian. The archive room, a vast space on the manor's ground floor, felt different in the stark light of day. Less menacing, more expectant. Rows upon rows of wooden cabinets, shelves overflowing with bound ledgers, and stacks of brittle paper waited. The air, thick with the scent of aged paper and fine dust, tickled my nose. I pulled on a pair of thin cotton gloves, my personal ritual for handling delicate documents, and resumed my work. I started with the oldest boxes, labeled simply Family Correspondence pre-1900. The initial letters were mundane, wedding announcements, reports on harvests, complaints about the weather. But as I delved deeper, a subtle shift in tone began to emerge. Early on, I found references to a distant cousin, a woman named Eleonora who was said to have vanished without a trace in the late 18th century. Not a dramatic disappearance, no frantic search described, just a quiet, almost clinical mention in a ledger, followed by a reallocation of her small inheritance. It was unsettlingly understated. Then came the journals. Not grand, leather-bound volumes, but small, unassuming notebooks, their covers faded, their pages filled with spidery, looping script. One belonged to a great-great-uncle, a man I knew only as a name on a sprawling family tree. His early entries were lucid, detailing daily life, but slowly, inexorably, they deteriorated. He wrote of the whisper in the walls, of shadows that drank the light, and of the pull towards the hidden depths. His prose became disjointed, unseen force. The final entry was a single stark word, repeated over and over until it filled the page: hunger, hunger, hunger. He too eventually faded from the family records, simply noted as having suffered from an unfortunate decline in mental faculties. I paused, rubbing my temples. Coincidence. The manor was old, isolated. Mental illness wasn't uncommon in previous centuries, often misunderstood, and people did disappear. It was a logical, if slightly uncomfortable, explanation. But the patterns, the specific language, began to grate against my rational armor. Hours later, my back aching, I was searching for a missing inventory list from the mid-19th century, believing it might shed light on some of the stranger heirlooms I'd glimpsed in other parts of the house. My search led me to a seldom-used corridor, one I hadn't fully explored, behind a heavy tapestry depicting a rather morbid hunting scene. The air here was colder, stagnant, carrying a faint metallic tang. The corridor ended abruptly at a stout, unvarnished wooden door secured with a heavy iron bolt. It felt out of place, almost like a dungeon entrance. My curiosity, a double-edged sword, urged me forward. The bolt shrieked as I slid it open, the sound echoing eerily in the confined space. Beyond was a short, dark passage, smelling strongly of dust and something else, something vaguely antiseptic yet stale. It opened into a small, windowless room. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a storage room. It was stark barren. In the center, a single heavy wooden chair was bolted to the floor, and dominating one entire wall, separating this small space from an equally barren room beyond, was a thick, unyielding sheet of glass. This was a visiting room with reinforced glass. My mind raced. Who would need such a room in a private manor? For what purpose? Confinement. Observation. The glass was scratched in places as if something had repeatedly scraped against it from the other side. And on the surface of the glass facing me at eye level was a faint, smeared handprint, barely visible in the dim light filtering in from the passage. It looked old but undeniably human. And then I heard it. Not a distinct word, but a low, sibilant rustle, like dry leaves skittering across stone, emanating from the other side of the reinforced glass. It was too soft, too fleeting to be real, surely. My imagination once again playing tricks. I pulled my hand back sharply, my heart giving a sudden, jarring lurch. I backed out of the room, my eyes fixed on the reinforced glass, then quickly slid the heavy bolt back into place, the clang resounding like a gunshot in the silent corridor. Back in the archive, my previous rationalizations felt flimsy, inadequate. The quiet disappearances, the descent into madness, the cryptic warnings in the journals, they all coalesced around the image of that stark room. What had they been trying to contain? Or more terrifyingly, what had they been trying to observe? They were echoes. Echoes from that room, echoes from those forgotten journals, echoes from a past that felt increasingly, terrifyingly present. My resolve, once so solid, had not just fractured, it was beginning to shatter. My rationality, that solid bedrock of my identity, began to fray. The old stories, the disappearances, the unsettling language in the archives, they weren't just curiosities anymore. They were whispers, growing louder, pressing in from the dust-choked corners of the manor. The air itself felt thicker, heavier, as if the very atmosphere held its breath around me. When I turned, there was nothing, only the settling dust motes dancing in the meager light filtering through grimy windows. But the feeling persisted, a prickle on the back of my neck, the sensation of being observed, not with curiosity, but with an unnerving, cold appraisal. I tried to dismiss it, of course. Isolation, a new environment, the stress of sorting through a deceased relative's life, it was all fertile ground for an overactive imagination. A familiar portrait, that of a stern-faced ancestor whose gaze had always seemed fixed on some distant horizon, now appeared to follow me as I passed, its painted eyes holding an accusation I couldn't quite decipher. Then came the sounds. Not the creaks and groans of an old house settling, but distinct, impossible sounds. A sigh, faint and mournful, just behind my shoulder as I catalogued a collection of antique maps. Arthur. It was my Greytant's voice, I was certain, though I barely remembered its timbre. But it was laced with something else, a brittle knowing quality that made my skin crawl. One afternoon, while attempting to organize a particularly chaotic stack of correspondence in the study, a book slid from a shelf above me. It didn't fall with a thud. It pitched, almost gracefully, landing open at my feet. The page it displayed was a faded photograph, an old daguerreotype of a young woman with wide, terrified eyes, her mouth a perfect, silent O of horror. I snatched up the book, my fingers trembling. I hadn't touched that shelf. The air in the room grew suddenly frigid, raising goosebumps along my arms. I spun around, but the room was empty. This wasn't just my imagination. I had to leave. I stumbled towards the front door, my mind racing. I'd pack only essentials, my car keys, my phone. I would drive until the manor was a distant, forgotten speck in the rearview mirror. It wasn't just tiredness. It was a sudden, crushing lassitude that sapped the strength from my limbs. My vision blurred, and the manor's grand entrance hall seemed to stretch and warp, the ceiling rising to an impossible height, the floorboards tilting beneath my feet. A low hum vibrated through the floor, a resonant thrum that seemed to originate from the very foundations of the house. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It was organic, like a giant, unseen heart beating slowly, deeply. The hum seemed to pull at me, a subtle but undeniable current drawing me back into the house's embrace. My steps faltered. My resolve, so fierce moments before, began to dissolve like sugar in hot tea. I found myself turning away from the door, my feet moving of their own accord, following the pervasive hum. It led me deeper into the manor, past rooms I hadn't thoroughly explored, down a narrow, unlit corridor that branched off from the main hall. I didn't remember seeing it before. It turned with a soft click, and the door swung inward, revealing a small, stark space. It was a visiting room with reinforced glass. The room was bare save for two bolted-down metal chairs facing each other across a thick pane of glass that bisected the space. The glass itself was scarred, etched with countless minute scratches, as if someone had tried to claw their way through it. This was not a part of the manor I had discovered in my initial survey. It felt wrong, deliberate, a place of observation, of confinement. And as I stood there staring at the scarred glass, I saw it. Its eyes, two pinpricks of malevolent light, were fixed on me, on my reflection in the glass. They weren't distinct words, just a cacophony of hushed, condemnatory voices, all speaking at once, all about me. They knew my secrets, my fears, the hidden truths I'd buried deep. I felt stripped bare, exposed. The house wasn't just isolated, it was a cage, and I was already inside. The book felt ancient, its leather binding cracked and brittle under my fingers. It wasn't a printed volume, but a handwritten journal, thick with cramped, looping script. The title, barely legible on the spine, was simply The Keeper's Ledger. I hadn't seen it before, not on any shelf I'd methodically catalogued. The coldness in the room intensified, making my breath miss slightly. I carried it to the desk, the heavy tome feeling almost alive in my grasp. My gray-tanned, spidery handwriting filled the first pages, dating back decades. It wasn't a diary in the traditional sense. It was a chronicle of observations, fragmented notes, and increasingly desperate warnings. It feeds, one entry stated, scrawled in a frantic hand, not on flesh, not on blood, on what we bury. The shame, the guilt, the unspeakable truths. It draws them out, makes them fester, until the soul itself unravels. My stomach clenched. This wasn't the rambling of a lonely woman, this was a terrified account. She detailed how the entity would whisper forgotten slights, dredge up childhood humiliations, twist benign memories into instruments of self-loathing. It wasn't about grand evils, but the quiet, corrosive ones we all carry. It weaves illusions, makes you see what you fear most, hear what you desperately wish to forget. There were crude drawings, too not of a monster, but of intricate, almost geometric patterns that seemed to pulse on the page like diagrams of a psychic trap. Beneath it, a single word, consumption. Then I found it, a folded, brittle letter tucked deep within the ledger, secured with a faded ribbon. It was addressed to my successor, in a hand that was shakier, more resigned than the journal entries. Arthur, it began, my name. A jolt went through me, she knew. If you are reading this, I have failed. The inheritance is not property, but a burden, a curse. The entity, the collector as I came to call it, is ancient. It latched onto this lineage generations ago. This manor is its anchor, its hunting ground. It thrives on the psychological torment of its hosts, and once it has consumed enough, the soul does not pass on. It remains, trapped. A whisper in the walls, a shadow in the corners, adding to its power. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. Trapped souls. They weren't just illusions, they were echoes. The letter continued, each word a hammer blow. I tried to understand it, to contain it. I built a place, a barrier within the manor itself, hoping to observe its effects without succumbing. A desperate attempt to find a weakness to protect future generations. But it only made it stronger. It learned from my observations, twisted my resolve. My own truths became its sustenance. A child she abandoned. The shock of this personal revelation for her was profound. It explained so much about her reclusive life, her enigmatic nature. And then the critical detail, the room. I called it the observation chamber, though it became my prison. The visiting room with reinforced glass. I spent countless hours there trying to quantify the unquantifiable, trying to build a cage for a thing without form. If you are to have any hope, Arthur, you must find it, but beware. It is not empty. It holds the echoes of its past victims, and it will try to lure you in to break you. It is the heart of its trap. My breath hitched again. The Grey Tant wasn't just a victim. He was a desperate, misguided guardian who, in her attempt to understand, had only fed the beast and solidified its hold. He had left me not a legacy, but a ticking psychological time bomb. The air in the study grew thick, heavy with an unseen presence. I heard a faint, high-pitched keening sound, not from outside, but from within the walls, as if the manor itself was weeping. It was the sound of agony, of trapped despair, and it was growing louder. My hands trembled, clutching the letter. The entity wasn't just some vague, malevolent force. It was a precise, insidious predator, meticulously stripping away sanity, feeding on the most intimate, painful parts of the human psyche. And I, Arthur, the pragmatic historian, had just stumbled into its lair, bringing with me my own hidden truths, my own carefully guarded vulnerabilities. It had been waiting. It was still waiting. And now I knew where its heart lay, the visiting room with reinforced glass. And I knew it wanted me, or perhaps I was simply walking into the next trap. I was no longer alone. My Grey Tant. Not a victim, not entirely. A guardian, yes, but one whose desperate attempts to understand had only fueled the very thing she sought to contain. She hadn't just left me in a state. She'd bequeathed me a psychological time bomb, ticking in the silence of these vast, echoing rooms. I stumbled out, the revelation about her a fresh wound in my mind, stinging with a sense of betrayal and profound unease. The manor itself seemed to shift around me, its old timbers groaning, not with the sound of settling wood, but with a deeper, more deliberate sigh. My own name, hers, something else entirely. The days that followed blurred into a disorienting haze. Sleep offered no respite, only vivid, fragmented dreams that felt more like stolen memories. My past, once a neatly catalogued collection of events, began to fray at the edges. Had I really gone to that university? Had my parents truly said those words? The certainty I'd always relied on, the bedrock of my identity, started to crumble. The entity wasn't just lurking anymore, it was actively dissecting me, piece by agonizing piece. No, its attack was far more insidious, a subtle erosion of my very being. I'd walk into a room convinced I was looking for a specific book, only to stand there utterly blank. The purpose of my journey vanished. I'd find my hand hovering over a page, a name highlighted, a note scribbled in the margin, but the handwriting wasn't mine. It was a neat, elegant script, eerily familiar yet utterly alien. My Grey Tant's, perhaps, or something else entirely. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting. Waiting for me for what? A confession, a secret it seemed to crave with an insatiable hunger. I didn't know what secret it wanted, or even if I possessed such a thing. My life, I thought, had been remarkably straightforward, devoid of grand, hidden truths. But the entity seemed to know otherwise, poking and prodding at the foundations of my memory, searching for cracks. It was a wing off the main drawing room, tucked behind a heavy velvet curtain that seemed to have been designed to conceal rather than merely adorn. It had no handle, only a small brass plate that read, in faded script, "Visiting Room." My brow furrowed. What kind of visiting room? This wasn't a public building. Cautiously, I pushed the door open. The room inside was small, almost cell-like, with a single, sturdy wooden chair bolted to the floor. Opposite it, dominating the far wall, was a massive pane of reinforced glass, thick and slightly distorted like the bottom of an ancient bottle. On the other side of the glass, I could dimly make out another, identical chair in an equally stark space. A speaking tube, a relic of an older era, was set into the wall beside the glass on my side, its mouthpiece tarnished with age. This wasn't for casual visitors. This was for someone to be observed, or to observe someone in absolute isolation. The implications were horrifying. Who had sat here? Who had been on the other side? Had my Grey Tant used this to see? What? I pulled the chair away from its bolts, ignoring the protesting groan of the ancient wood, and sat down, my gaze fixed on the reinforced glass. It reflected my own face back at me, pale and drawn, but for a fleeting moment, I saw something else flicker in the reflection. I blinked and it was gone, leaving only my anxious, tired face. Not audible, not quite. More like thoughts that weren't my own, insinuating themselves into the quiet corners of my mind. "What are you hiding, Arthur? You know, don't you?" The sound seemed to be swallowed by the reinforced glass, echoing back as a faint, mocking sigh. The memories began to flicker again, but this time they were twisted, tainted. A childhood argument with my father, suddenly imbued with a malicious undertone I couldn't recall. A moment of youthful indiscretion, magnified into a damning betrayal. The entity wasn't just questioning my past, it was rewriting it, planting seeds of doubt and guilt where none had existed. It was showing me a version of Arthur that was petty, cruel, deceitful, a version I didn't recognize, yet one that felt disturbingly plausible in the face of this relentless psychological assault. But there was nothing there, just the empty chair mocking my isolation. "Confess, Arthur." It wasn't a voice but an impulse, a raw primal urge to unburden myself, to release whatever hidden truth it sought. But what truth? I racked my brain, desperately trying to find the secret it craved, trying to connect the dots of these fragmented, twisted memories. Had I truly done something so terrible, so profound, that it could give rise to this ancient malevolence? The manor seemed to hold its breath, the very air vibrating with anticipation, waiting for me to break, to surrender the secret that would complete its hold. I gripped the arms of the chair, my knuckles white. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice thin and reedy in the oppressive silence. The memories began to flicker again, but this time they were sharper, less like vague specters and more like precise, cutting shards. Not just my memories, but something older, inherited, pressing against the inside of my skull. The man across from me, the one who had introduced himself only as a colleague of my gray tant, leaned forward, his face a pale, indistinct blur behind the thick pain. His voice, piped through the small, perforated speaker, was devoid of any warmth, a dry rustle of leaves in an empty room. "The entity," he continued as if I hadn't spoken, "does not simply feed on hidden truths, Arthur. It is hidden truth. Every lie, every carefully constructed illusion, every truth they buried deep within the manor's walls and within themselves became its sustenance. It grew, Arthur, it thrived on the silence." A cold knot tightened in my gut. This wasn't just about some malevolent spirit, it was about my family. The historian in me, usually so detached and analytical, recoiled from the personal implication. So what? It just keeps growing until it. What? Truth, you see, is both its food and its poison. But not just any truth. The secrets it craves are those that define who you are, the ones you guard most fiercely. To starve it, Arthur, you must expose a truth so raw, so deeply personal that it cannot be assimilated. That's anathema. What kind of truth? The visitor's eyes, even blurred through the glass, seemed to bore into me. The truth of who you are. Not the Arthur you present to the world, the pragmatic historian, the emotionally detached intellectual, but the Arthur hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed indifference, the Arthur that even you rarely acknowledge. A tremor ran through me. This was the most insidious part. It wasn't about some ancient incantation from a forgotten tome. It was about dissecting my own soul. I had always prided myself on my composure, my ability to maintain a rational distance from emotional chaos. But her truths were too entangled, too muddled by generations of half-lies and self-deception. It merely fed her struggle back to her, twisting her mind until she became another vessel for its influence. He was trying to warn you, Arthur. My gray tant's frantic, fragmented notes, the hidden compartments, the locked rooms. It all started to coalesce into a terrifying, coherent narrative. There is a way, the visitor continued, pulling me back to the present. A specific act. It's not a ritual of binding, not in the traditional sense, more of an offering, a sacrifice perhaps of your most sacred privacy. The manor itself is designed for it. The central hearth in the main hall, not the one you first saw, but the older, deeper one in the original structure beneath the current floorboards. Your gray tant began to uncover it. It's a focal point, a conduit for this kind of profound exposure. He paused, letting the words hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. You must return to the manor, find the true hearth, and there you must lay bare the truth you have most assiduously concealed. The truth that shapes your deepest fears, your most profound regrets. The truth that, if exposed, would shatter the carefully constructed reality you inhabit. My hands clenched into fists, digging my nails into my palms. This was it, the precipice. The entity didn't want my life, it wanted myself. It wanted to dismantle me from the inside out, but the alternative. The alternative was to let it continue its insidious work, to become another empty shell like my gray tant, another victim in a long line. It will be painful, the visitor warned, his voice softening just a fraction, a brief flicker of something almost akin to empathy. Excruciating, perhaps. It will feel like dying, but it is the only way to break the cycle, to starve it, to finally sever its connection to your family line. I pushed myself up from the chair, the sudden movement scraping against the floor and echoing unnaturally in the confined space. The air in the visiting room felt impossibly heavy, charged with the weight of generations of secrets. My head throbbed, a dull, persistent ache behind my eyes. I had always considered myself a man of facts, of logic, but logic had led me here to this sterile room, to this impossible proposition. The thought was horrifying, yet liberating in a twisted, desperate way. If this was the only path to stopping it, then I would walk it. I would return to the manor. I would find the hearth. And I would unleash my truth, no matter the cost. I looked across the table, not at the empty chair opposite, but at the reinforced glass that separated this room from whatever lay beyond. My hands, clammy and trembling slightly, reached for the satchel I'd brought. Inside, among the usual historian's tools, notebooks, pens, a small flashlight lay the key. Not a physical key, but the knowledge I'd painstakingly extracted from the archives. The entity fed on hidden truths, on secrets buried deep, left to fester in the dark. My gray tant's journals, filled with frantic scrawls and coded warnings, had hinted at a way to starve it, to weaken it, perhaps even to bind it. It demanded revelation, and I would give it what it craved, but on my terms. A faint whisper snaked through the silence, coiling around my ears like a cold mist. It wasn't a language I recognized, but the tone was unmistakable, a predatory purr, a low, hungry rumble that seemed to vibrate in my bones. The reinforced glass shimmered, reflecting my distorted image back at me, pulling at the fine hairs on my arms. I forced myself to meet the non-existent gaze beyond the glass. This was it, the moment I either broke or fought back. The first illusion struck with the force of a physical blow. The table before me blurred, the reinforced glass melted away, and I was no longer in the visiting room. I was in a hospital waiting area, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the smell of antiseptic cloying in my throat. My mother sat beside me, her face drawn, her hand clutching a crumpled tissue. On the television screen, a news anchor reported on a devastating highway pileup. "Your sister," a voice hissed close to my ear, "gone too soon." My breath hitched. I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting the vision, the memory. It was true, all of it. My younger sister, Clara, taken in a senseless accident years ago. I had been 22, pragmatic even then, burying my grief under a mountain of academic work, refusing to speak of her, to feel the pain. I had told myself it was resilience, strength, but it was cowardice. It had found a nerve, becoming opaque, a swirling vortex of deep indigo. Shapes writhed within it, skeletal fingers reaching out, beckoning. I knew what it was doing. It was trying to pull me deeper into its web of lies, to overwhelm me with guilt and sorrow until I was nothing but an empty vessel. Clara. I said the name, a raw sound on my tongue, a word I hadn't spoken aloud in years without an objective, academic distance. My sister, she died, and I didn't cry that it was unproductive. I built walls around myself, not just from the world but from my own heart. A tremor ran through the reinforced glass, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the floorboards. I treated her death like an unfortunate data point, not the loss of a vibrant, loving person. I was a coward. I was afraid to feel, afraid to break. The reinforced glass began to crack, thin, spiderweb lines appearing from its center, spreading outwards like frozen lightning. It was a physical sound, tearing at the air, making my teeth ache. The entity was recoiling. My raw, unvarnished truth, the one I had kept hidden even from myself, was poison to it. I loved her. I cried out, the words a sob, a release, a dam breaking. And I regret that I didn't grieve her properly. I regret it more than anything. The shriek intensified, a deafening crescendo that made the very foundations of the manor groan. The cracks in the reinforced glass widened, spiderwebbing across its entire surface, and then with a final, ear-splitting report, it shattered. My body sagged, exhaustion washing over me like a tide. The air, though still cool, no longer felt predatory. It was just air. A faint, almost imperceptible hum lingered, a dying echo of the entity's presence, but it was distant, diminished. It was wounded. And I, Arthur the pragmatic historian, was finally, irrevocably broken open. The sacrifice was made. The truth revealed. And in its wake, an emptiness that was terrifying, yet strangely, profoundly quiet. The reinforced glass, already a spiderweb of cracks, groaned with a terrible finality. Then, with a report that echoed through my skull long after the sound itself died, it didn't just shatter, it imploded. I felt a sudden vacuum, a rush of cold air that smelled of ozone and damp earth, as if the very atmosphere of the room had been violently sucked inwards. The deafening noise was replaced by an abrupt, absolute silence, a void so profound it left my ears ringing with phantom echoes. My body, braced for impact, swayed precariously. I stumbled forward, my hands flying out to steady myself against the cold, grimy wall, my knuckles scraping against rough plaster. The visiting room with reinforced glass was a ruin. Shards, thick and jagged, lay scattered across the floor, glinting dully in the dim, filtered light from the high, grimy windows. They hadn't sprayed outwards as I'd expected from an explosion. Instead, they'd been drawn in, leaving a raw, gaping aperture in the wall like a wound in the manor's stone flesh. Utterly. My breath hitched, a ragged, painful gasp. Was it truly over? Had it imploded upon itself, consumed by its own trapped essence? I took a tentative step closer, my boots crunching on the glass. The air within the ruined visiting room felt thin, devoid of life, yet strangely clean. No lingering foulness, no psychic residue that I could discern, just emptiness. The walls, once vibrating with an unseen energy, now stood inert, silent witnesses to a horror that had devoured itself. A wave of exhaustion, so profound it threatened to buckle my knees, washed over me. It was as if every nerve ending, every muscle fiber had been stretched to its absolute limit and then abruptly released. My head throbbed, a dull ache behind my eyes, and my hands trembled uncontrollably. I sank to the floor, uncaring of the glass fragments or the dust, leaning my back against the cold stone. My mind, which had been a frantic, desperate battlefield for weeks, was suddenly, startlingly quiet. What was I without the constant struggle? Who was Arthur, now that the entity was no longer actively trying to unravel him? I ran a hand over my face, feeling the grit and sweat, the stubble that had grown unchecked. My gray tant's warnings, her cryptic notes, the sheer weight of this manor's history, it all coalesced into a stark, horrifying truth. And now perhaps it was simply absorbed back into the very stone, a dormant, waiting thing. I had faced it, yes. I had endured, but I hadn't walked away unscathed. I felt different. I pushed myself up, my muscles aching, and surveyed the manor around me. The grand hall, visible through the archway, seemed bathed in a muted, almost mournful light. The ancestral portraits on the walls stared down with their usual impassive gazes, but now I saw them differently. The entity was contained, or defeated, or simply gone. But the experience had carved something deep into me. I was no longer the pragmatic historian who had arrived here, intent on cataloging dusty archives. I walked slowly out of the ruined visiting room, past the shattered glass and into the hushed expanse of the manor. The manor was quiet now, yes, but it was a quiet born of exhaustion, a temporary lull. I felt it in my bones, a lingering resonance of the struggle, a faint hum beneath the surface of reality. I was free in a sense. The immediate threat had receded, but the freedom felt like a heavy cloak, woven from the threads of what I had witnessed. I knew too much. The resolution wasn't an ending, but a transformation. I was no longer just Arthur, the historian.